Hi everyone, welcome back. My name is Yuna, and today we're going to be doing another monthly wrap-up. February's come to a close and I've read 13 or 14 books this month. I'm not positive, but 13 or 14. And it's been kind of a meh reading month for me. I had a couple of good reads, but mostly I feel like the books kind of coasted around the middle. I didn't have any that I absolutely hated. Mostly they were pretty mid, just kind of okay. Let's jump right in with the first book that I read this month, which was Natural Beauty by Ling Huang. I was really excited to read this book. I had heard such great things about it, so I am happy to say that I did really enjoy this. This is a horror literary fiction book that follows a Chinese-American piano prodigy as she begins to work at a wellness beauty company in order to support her parents who are in need of care. And things start to get really freaking weird. I thought this was such a grotesquely good time, and it incorporates a lot of different topics. There's Eurocentric beauty standards, the exploitation of people of color, toxic wellness, envy, obsession, immigrant trauma, assimilation. Like I said, the main character is Chinese American, and her relationship with her parents made me so emotional. It really resonated with me as the daughter of Asian immigrant parents. Just the way that they express such tender devotion to their child, the sacrifice, the acts of service, it really, just thinking about it right now makes me emotional because, like I said, it really reminds me of my parents and my relationship with my mom and my dad. As part of the exploration of adopting and assimilating to Eurocentric beauty standards, Ling Huang also talks about the sentiment of seeing your parents and your heritage in your physical appearance, and that also just really hit home for me. As a Korean who immigrated to America and grew up here, how long did it take me to stop hating my own face, hating my eyes, hating my nose? How long did it take me to stop being embarrassed of these things that are reflections of my parents, that are physical legacies of my family? Yeah, I thought it was a really excellent book. It made me uncomfortable. It was creepy. It was gross at parts. There's some body horror involved. Strong start to the month. I gave Natural Beauty 4 stars, and I'm really excited to read Ling Huang's other book, Immaculate Conception. I heard that it is very different, but I'm hoping I'll enjoy it just as much. All right, after Natural Beauty, I moved on to Lie With Me by Philippe Besson. I don't freaking know. Now, I went into this pretty nervous because I did not enjoy his other book, In the Absence of Men. If you saw my last reading wrap up, you'll know that I found that book incredibly uncomfortable and thought that there was a really gross and inappropriate relationship between a teenage boy and an adult man. Because of that experience, I went into this bracing myself. Lie With Me was definitely a much more enjoyable experience, but I have to say that for whatever reason, it didn't quite move me as much as I think it moved some other people. The book is about two boys and their first queer love with each other, and I think that it was a really lovely exploration of sexuality and repression, the life that could have been. I fully agree with people who love this book that it is a rather heartbreaking look at what internalized and external homophobia can do to love. And yet, for some reason, even though I know that here, I think that, I just, for some reason, ended up not being emotionally invested enough to be really moved by the story. There was a section of this book where the narrator, as a grown man, is looking at a teenage boy who reminds him of his first love, and he has this unexpected sort of complicated attraction to the boy. It's a fleeting and unexpected attraction, and it's not at all supposed to be indicative, I think, of a narrator having an attraction or affinity for young boys, but in light of In the Absence of Men, it just made me uncomfortable. I'll link my other wrap-up video where I go into more detail about In the Absence of Men and that really gross, inappropriate age gap relationship. I'm in no way saying that this book made me as uncomfortable as In the Absence of Men, or that the narrator's, fleeting, confusing moment of attraction was nearly as problematic as the relationship in the other book. But it just makes me some type of uncomfortable that the author has chosen in multiple books to have adult men having any sort of attraction, fleeting or not, to younger boys. So I don't know. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. I can see why people think that it's a very moving, important story about queer love and what can happen to queer love under homophobic eyes. It just ended up not quite being the book for me. Next, I read The Last Conversation, which is another short story from that collection of sci-fi short stories by different authors that I've been reading. Last month, I read 3 of the stories. This month, I read this, and next month, I'll finish off the last 2. This had an interesting premise, but much like the other stories I've read so far, I found it just fine. It was pretty forgettable to me, and I'm pretty sure that after I film this video, I'm never going to think about it again. I was only ever really interested in the short story collection because N.K. Jemisin, who is one of my favorite authors, has a story in the collection. I just ended up deciding to read all of them because they are really short. So far, none have been more than just okay to me, so I'm really hoping that next month I read N.K. Jemisin's and it's incredible and makes this whole experience worth it. I gave the story 2.75. It wasn't offensive or poorly written necessarily. I was just kind of like, meh. Okay, now we're moving on to the part of this month's wrap-up where I have to rant just a little bit. I've mentioned in multiple videos that I am on a quest this year to find a grimdark book or series that I really fall in love with. With that goal in mind, I picked up and read the First Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie because I heard that Joe Abercrombie is the king of grimdark. I read all 3 of the books this month, and I have to say that I ended up feeling pretty lukewarm about these. The First Law series is a sort of classic medieval setting grimdark story with a large cast of characters, multiple points of views. I'll start with the positives. I think the prose is simple and accessible and easy to read. I thought that one of the POV characters, Glocta, was freaking hilarious, and I really enjoyed him until something he did at the very end, which I will go into. Now I'm going to talk about the things that didn't work for me with this series. I'm going to do a vague spoiler-free section, and then I will let you know when I'm going to be diving into some spoilers. If I had to break down my personal qualms with this series, I would say that 1, the plotlessness was done in a way that made me feel disoriented. 2, the characters felt very archetypal and almost predictable, and some of them had almost no growth or change through the 3-book series. And 3, I was pretty disappointed in the female characters. I mentioned in previous videos that I wasn't really sure what the premise or plot of this series is, and it turns out it's because for most of it, there really isn't a plot. A general background plot does solidify, I think, maybe halfway through the 2nd book, but at least for most of the first and the beginning of the 2nd book, there wasn't really a unifying plot, and it made me feel quite unanchored. I remember in the 1st book, I felt so lost because it just felt like characters were doing things, they were going their own ways, and at the end of this book, if you had asked me what we were moving towards, what the plot was, or what the goal was, I really wouldn't have been able to tell you. And here's the thing, I don't mind character-driven stories where the plot is minimal or nearly non-existent. It just felt to me that this series didn't really commit to that setup. It felt like it was dangling the potential of this big epic fantasy plotline that didn't ever really solidify. People have already said to me that I shouldn't harp on the lack of plot because it's supposed to be a character-driven story. So let's talk about the characters because they didn't really do it for me either. Let me say right now, I don't think that the characters were necessarily bad. I just wasn't expecting them to feel so predictable. Most of the characters were complicated or unlikable in the way that you might expect from the genre, but it was in a very archetypal way. Maybe because of how hyped Joe Abercrombie is in the grimdark circle, I thought for some reason that the characters were going to be very fresh or unconventional or character types that I hadn't seen before, but they ended up being pretty cookie cutter in my opinion. You have the vain and selfish noble who ends up getting humbled by hardship, a la Jaime Lannister. You have the steady and sort of stoic warrior. You have a feral, very rough around the edges woman. The characters who did have arcs had pretty predictable arcs, and then there were a bunch of characters who I felt like from page 1 of book 1 to the ending of book 3 barely changed at all. I was also disappointed by the few main women who were in the story. While not necessarily offensive, I just didn't think that they had the same depth or agency as their male counterparts. Pharaoh, who is one of the main sort of POV characters, felt like an attempt to write a fierce woman character who ended up to me feeling like a caricature, and she doesn't really change very much through the series. The other main female character in the story is Artie, who I did enjoy more than Pharaoh. I thought she had more depth than that character, but I still felt like the trajectory of her life and her storyline was tied to the whims and decisions of the men in the story. From what I heard, Abercrombie did take people's criticisms about his female characters really well and develop them much better in future books. Now I'm going to start the spoiler section / go more into depth on my thoughts. Let's talk a bit more about the women. Farrow was disappointing to me because, like I said, she felt like an attempt to write a fierce woman that robbed her of the possibility of a lot of nuance. She's written as basically feral. She hisses at people. She is quick to kill, quick to fight, has almost no softness to her. That's how she starts in the first book, and that's essentially how she ends in the third book. I'm not saying that there was absolutely no change, but I was hoping that after this many pages, there would be just a bit more development to her character. In the series, she ends up getting romantically, sexually involved with another one of the POV characters, Logan. That relationship shows potential for being the catalyst for change or some sort of growth for both Logan and Farrow, but it ends up going nowhere in a really unsatisfying way. I didn't expect rainbows and walking off into the sunset hand in hand. I know this is grimdark, but I still thought that there'd be some sort of payoff instead of them just circling right back to where they were. Artie is the other main female character, like I said, and she does have, I think, more complexity, but her storyline and her life and decisions were all very much tied to the men in her life, to her abusive father, to her abusive brother, to two other POV characters, Luther and Glokta. She starts the story as a woman with very little power at the whims of men, and by the end of the third book, she is still a woman with very little power whose life revolves around the whims of men. Artie has a romantic sexual relationship with Luther, who I mentioned is another POV character. By the end of the third book, Luther is actually the new king, and she is pregnant with his bastard child. In order to protect herself and her child and hide her child's parentage, she has to marry a man who she had no intention of being with, Glokta. Her marriage to Glokta isn't completely soulless or devoid of affection. They do have a positive relationship and friendship, but if the sum total of her growth and agency at the end of this entire series is that she will make the best of her forced marriage, I don't know. I just want more for women. Logan, who is the character that I mentioned was in a relationship with Farrow, is another character archetype that I like. The stoic, strong warrior with a bloody past, but a kind heart. But again, I just didn't think that his character really went anywhere. It's interesting because the first scene of the first book and the last scene of the third book are actually mirrors of each other. In the beginning of book 1, Logan is falling off a cliff into water, and at the end of the trilogy, he has jumped out of this building and is again falling into water. Now, this would be a very clever and satisfying framing device if he had gone some sort of internal transformation, right? We're in the same place, we're going through the same scene, but as a changed man. But instead, for me, it actually drove home the feeling that I had read these 3 books and this man essentially circled back to more or less the same person that he had been thousands of pages ago. Now, my favorite character, and who probably kept me going through the series, was Glokta. Glokta is an inquisitor who tortures people, and I thought he was a damn menace. He was a riot. He made me laugh, he had complexity, he had moments of introspection and change. I thought he was a believable mix of callousness and cruelty while also having moments of showing kindness or compassion. But he ruined it at the very end. At the end of the story, as I mentioned, the character Luther has become king and is married to a woman who refuses to sleep with him. This is problematic because Luther as king needs heirs, he needs kids. Glokta goes to talk to the queen to try to convince her to do her wifely duties, and in the midst of that conversation realizes that the reason, or at least part of the reason she is refusing to sleep with Luther is because she is a lesbian and she is in love with and in a secret relationship with her handmaid. Glokta decides to take advantage of this and takes the maid hostage in front of the queen's eyes and tells the queen that unless she lets the king essentially rape and impregnate her multiple times, and unless she bears him 3 to 4 children, they will torture and kill her love. The queen, of course, is so distraught and she agrees to do this, and I just found this absolutely disgusting. Listen, I was absolutely fine with him pulling out people's teeth, cutting off people's fingers, but this just wasn't for me. And I'm not even saying that that was too dark for grimdark or anything like that. I'm just saying that Glokta was the one element of the book that I found consistently enjoyable, and unfortunately at the end, that was snatched from me because what he did personally was unforgivable. I know that that was a lot of rambling and probably incoherent to anyone who hasn't read the entire series, so I'll try to sum it up. I gave the series overall a 2.75 or 3-star rating. While the writing was accessible and pretty easy to read, I thought that the characters were a bit too archetypal and predictable. I thought that the characters either had very predictable character arcs or didn't change or grow enough for it to feel like a satisfying trilogy. I thought that the female characters were pretty disappointing. And I don't think that the balance of character-driven versus plot-driven was handled very well. I know a lot of people really love the series and really love Joe Abercrombie, and I love that for you, genuinely. It just ended up not being the one for me, but I will continue to try and find a grimdark series that I love. That was my major ramble/rant for the video. I promise the rest are going to be shorter. After that, I read This Thing Between Us. This is a book that wasn't even on my radar. I didn't even know it existed, but my friend who really likes horror read said that she blasted through it in a day, so I ended up borrowing it from her. This is a fever dream of a techno thriller with supernatural elements to it. If any of you have seen the horror movie It Follows, which I hate, that movie messed me up for so long. If you've seen that movie, this kind of has some vaguely It Follows vibes, but a completely different premise. In this book, the narrator Thiago, whose wife has recently passed away, starts experiencing these weird happenings with a device that is sort of a Google Home or Alexa type device. This book was interesting because I couldn't really nail down what was going to happen, and the horror elements that kept being introduced were not what I expected. It's a supernatural techno thriller horror book, but at its core, it is a book about grief and loss. I really like that the story also incorporated cultural identity and the estrangement from your culture. Thiago has, I believe, Mexican heritage, but he is disconnected from it, and that's brought up several times. In fact, there's a part of this book where you realize that his inability to speak Spanish may have cost him the chance to learn how to defeat this entity that is haunting him. I thought that the first 65 to 75% of this book was really gripping and strong and fast-paced, but the last bit kind of unraveled for me. I think it lost a lot of the momentum and direction, and while I like what the book did, I don't really know that it was executed well. It felt like a very jarring shift in tone. Overall, I still had a good time. I also ended up reading this book in a day. I would recommend to people who like horror or thriller, but just with the caveat that I personally didn't think that the ending was as strong as it could have been. I did give this book 3.5 stars. Following that, I finished a memoir that I have been really excited to get to, and that is Educated by Tara Westover. This is a memoir about a girl who was raised in a survivalist family who steps into a classroom for the first time at 17 years old. I've seen some people complain that this isn't a very informative book on Mormonism, and I'm not sure why, because it never claims to be. I think actually she explicitly says in the beginning that this isn't supposed to be about that. I think that at its core, this is a story about the complexity of toxic familial relationships and the power of realizing that you don't have to believe what you're told. I appreciate that multiple times in the book, Tara says that her and her family's accounts of certain events differed. I personally can have trouble accurately remembering things that happened literally days ago, and they're not even tied to emotional trauma. Imagine how difficult it must be to try to accurately remember and talk about events that happened over a decade ago that were traumatic and painful and difficult to understand even in the moment. I am not rating this book because while I do read memoirs critically, I'm personally pretty hesitant to criticize or rate them. If anything, I'll just rate them 5 stars and move on. But I've just decided that I'm not super comfortable rating memoirs like that. That said, I did enjoy it and I would recommend it. If you do want to pick up the book though, and you're going to do the audiobook, I have to warn you that they do say the N-word multiple times, hard R and all. The word is censored in the physical book, but in the audiobook, they full out say it. I didn't realize, and that was a jump scare I wasn't expecting. After Educated, I moved on to a much more fun read with Howl's Moving Castle. This is by Diana Wynne Jones and is the book that the Ghibli movie Howl's Moving Castle is based off of. This is such a fun and cozy fantasy that I admit I can't rate objectively because I'm coming at it from a place of absolutely loving the Ghibli movie. It has such a special place in my heart. My mom and I both love the movie. We've seen it multiple times in theaters, out of theaters. We even went to the live orchestral performance of Joe Hisaishi doing the soundtracks from multiple Ghibli movies. So I'm already such a fan of the world that it's hard for me to separate out that existing affection from the experience of reading the book. For anyone who doesn't know, Howl's Moving Castle is the story of Sophie Hatter, who lives in this magical world. She ends up getting cursed by a witch called the Witch of the Waste and is transformed into this creaky, dusty old woman. To try to break the curse, she ends up entering the moving castle of this wizard named Howl, who is rumored to eat the hearts of beautiful young girls. So she sneaks into his castle and she makes a deal with this fire demon named Calcifer, who is magically tied to the castle. And from there, it's this whirlwind adventure of enchantment and witches and falling stars and demons and just so much fun. I think the book is definitely worth reading for anyone who enjoyed the movie. The two are different enough that the book felt like a breath of fresh air while still striking that chord of nostalgia. There are a bunch of differences that I wasn't expecting, so spoilers here on out. One of the things that I loved about Book Sophie is that she actually has magical powers of her own, which I guess is suggested in the movie, but it is talked about in much more detail and much more explicitly in this book. Sophie herself is revealed to be a witch and to have her own set of magical powers, which I freaking loved. Another key difference that absolutely bamboozled me is that in this book, there is an interdimensional traveling / world jumping element to it. And Howl is actually from Wales, like Wales from our world. His family lives in our world in Wales, has a television, has a car. Howl has a rugby jacket. He plays on a rugby team. The book doesn't really explain the magic that allows them to jump from world to world, but there's a point at which Howl takes Sophie to Wales. And when I realized what was happening, I was like, what? Anyway, I gave this book 4 stars. Like I said, might be a bit biased by my love for the world and the extended media, but it's quick, it's fun, it's cozy, it's charming, and I didn't realize that this is the first book in a trilogy, so I think I'm probably going to end up reading those other books at some point. Continuing with the fantasy reads, next I read the Fractured Fable series by Alex E. Harrow. This is made up of Spindle Shattered and Mirror Mended, and I didn't realize that this is a series. I thought it was just a collection of 2 fantasy retellings. I'm glad I read it in the right order because it is essentially one series, and if I read Mirror Mended first, it would have made no sense to me. The Fractured Fable series is made of these 2 novellas, which are modern feminist retellings of Sleeping Beauty and Snow White. The main character of both books is Zinnia Gray, who is a young woman who grew up with a terminal disease and was always preparing for her own death. Zinnia ends up in an alternate dimension, which is one of the many versions of Sleeping Beauty, and there she realizes that she lives in and has access to this multiverse, which includes all these different versions of fairy tales. She also realizes that her world and her life is a modern retelling of Sleeping Beauty. I won't go too much into the plot of either book, but in the second book, she ends up traveling to a dimension which contains a version of Snow White and partners up with the evil queen. I thought that these were fun. I was surprised at how modern it was. There's a lot of modern language, pop culture references, stuff like that. I had a pretty good time. I would give this series like a 3-star overall, but it did make me a little bit apprehensive about reading The Everlasting. Some of you will know that as part of my search for a romantasy or romance fantasy book that I fall in love with, I was planning to read The Everlasting. I just fear that if it's written in the same style or with the same voice, I'm not gonna love it as much as I was hoping, but we will see. I thought they were fun, I thought they were fine, but I'm not gonna be screaming about them from any rooftops or hurrying to recommend them to anybody. Almost done with the month, and I had my first and only 5-star read, which was actually a reread. That was Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I don't know if you can see, but my copy is so beat up. It is taped back together. It is all warped from being caught in the rain. I just adore this book. I first read this book maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and at the time I was so very moved by it, and I was hoping for a similar experience on a reread. Was not disappointed. This book is written by Robin Kimmerer, who is a botanist and a member of the Potawatomi Nation. It is a collection of indigenous wisdoms and teachings and observations about humankind's relationship with the earth and how it is currently one that is characterized by separation and extraction and abuse and a superiority complex on our part. This current state is countered in this book by, like I said, indigenous wisdoms and teachings that encourage and invite us to think about different ways of existing in and alongside nature, other ways that are more reciprocal and sustainable and rooted in love and care for the one and only home that we have. This book for me is just such a tender and heartfelt invitation to imagine a more beautiful world and a way of being that, again, honors our one home. I wish that this was required reading for everyone. I wish I lived in an alternate timeline in which these indigenous frameworks and indigenous ways of living were the standard and not considered hippie or alternative. I have to read you a few passages that really moved me. Indulgent self-interest that our people once held to be monstrous is now celebrated as success. We are asked to admire what our people viewed as unforgivable. The consumption-driven mindset masquerades as quality of life, but eats us from within. It is as if we've been invited to a feast, but the table is laid with food that nourishes only emptiness, the black hole of the stomach that never fills. We have unleashed a monster. Another passage. As the temperature drops, single voices, clear and hollow, replace the keening chorus, the ancient speech of frogs. One word becomes clear, as if spoken in English. Here, here, here. The world is more than your thoughtless commute. We, the collateral, are your wealth, your teachers, your security, your family. Your strange hunger for ease should not mean a death sentence for the rest of creation. Weep, weep, calls a toad from the water's edge, and I do. If grief can be a doorway to love, then let us all weep for the world we are breaking apart so we can love it back to wholeness again. One of my favorite chapters of this book is called Learning the Grammar of Animacy, and it essentially talks about how English is a language in which we have no room to respect the animacy of non-human creatures. The arrogance of English is that the only way to be animate, to be worthy of respect and moral concern, is to be a human. This is the grammar of animacy. Imagine seeing your grandmother standing at a stove in her apron and then saying of her, "Look, it is making soup. It has gray hair." We might snicker at such a mistake, but we also recoil from it. In English, we would never refer to a member of our family or indeed to any person as it. That is a profound act of disrespect. It robs a person of selfhood and kinship, reduces a person to a mere thing. So it is in Potawatomi and other indigenous languages, we use the same words to address the living world as we use for our family, because they are our family. I could go on and just read so many passages from this book, but I highly recommend you pick it up. Each chapter is a slightly different lesson. It talks about a slightly different topic, so it's easy to read over time. You can binge it if you want, but I just think it's so comforting and warm and lovely. Lastly, in February, I started a new series, and that is the Neapolitan Quartet with My Brilliant Friend and The Story of a New Name, both by Elena Ferrante. These are the first two books in a quartet that follow the lives of two girls, Elena and Lila. The series follows the two girls and their extremely complicated relationship from young childhood all the way up through mature adulthood. Now, if you want to talk about character-driven stories, these are relentlessly character-driven. Elena Ferrante's writing style is extremely undecorated. It's very straightforward. She doesn't really seem to have any interest in dressing up the stories or events or the psychology of the characters with any lyricism. Elena and Lila grow up in this insular community in Naples, and you see through these two books they're interconnected but separate attempts to break from the webbing of those communities. Elena through sort of education and Lila through marriage. The first book follows them mostly through childhood up until they are like mid-teens, and the second book follows more of their older teen years. These girls are so messily human and complicated and real in a way that is almost annoying to read about. The two girls are extremely frustrating in different ways, and their relationship is so interesting. There's affection, but there's also pettiness and envy and jealousy and competition and comparison and reliance and interdependence. At least in these two books, Elena is filled with a lot of self-deprecation and self-doubt and is very easily swayed by things like any amount of appreciation or compliments. And Lila is so vindictive and cruel and poisonous and manipulative. Despite their many faults and many questionable decisions, I still feel really deeply for these two characters. These are only the first two books in the series, and I will be finishing the quartet. I'm really curious to see where this goes. As I said, there isn't really any dressing up of the story with these books. There isn't really lyricism or poetic writing. And I found the first book a little hard to get into just because I prefer a more lyrical writing style. But I was still really engaged by the psychology of these children and their weird relationship. I would give this personally for me maybe like a 3.5, 3.75. I liked it, but I wasn't in love with it. I would say that I really started locking in with the second book when the girls are a little bit older. They're still teenagers, but they're no longer like 5-year-old children. And so you see their psychology opening up a bit. You see the world expanding. You see their conflicts getting even more complicated. Story of a New Name, I would give 4 stars to. I was definitely more invested in this one. And like I said, I am very excited to get to the 3rd and 4th books and see what happens with these two girls. Once I've read the whole series, I will come back with my thoughts on the story as a whole, because Elena Ferrante has said to consider the 4 books one story or like one big book. I don't think in Elena Ferrante's mind they're really separated out as 4 books. After I finish reading the series, I may also watch the TV adaptation. I've heard that it is beautifully done. If you watched the series and would recommend it or not recommend it, let me know in the comments. That brings me to the end of my February wrap up. As you can see, I had a bit of a mixed bag of reading experiences, but I would say that the standout was definitely my reread of Braiding Sweetgrass. Love that book. Highly recommend. I also really enjoyed Natural Beauty and House of a Castle, and I am looking forward to finishing the Neapolitan Quartet. Let me know in the comments how your reading month went, if you had any favorites or any absolute duds. I'd love to hear about it. As always, thank you for being here and listening to me ramble. Happy reading, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. But wait, can we take a moment for my incredible Indigenous Sailor Moon t-shirt? I'll link the artist/seller in the description. I got this at a local powwow, but I'm pretty sure they have an online store. Okay, that's it. Bye for real.